He sends the message at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. Not a profound message, just, "I had a really good time tonight. I'm glad we're doing this." She reads it twice, then she puts the phone face down on the nightstand. Not because the message is bad, because something about it landed differently than she expected. Not like warmth, like wait, she will answer in the morning. But something has already shifted. This is not a story about falling out of love. It is a story about timing, specifically the timing of the exit. Because with some people, the withdrawal does not come after the argument. It does not come after the disappointment or when the relationship goes cold. It comes right after things go warm. The relationship reaches a new level of closeness, a vulnerable conversation, a moment of genuine connection, the first time someone says "I missed you" and means it completely. And within days, sometimes hours, the person who seemed most present becomes the most difficult to reach. Texts slow down, responses get shorter, plans start falling through. From the outside, it looks like they stopped caring. That is the first wrong explanation, and it is worth examining carefully, because it is the one that causes the most damage. In the early 1970s, a developmental psychologist named Mary Ainsworth conducted an experiment that would become one of the most replicated findings in attachment research. She called it the strange situation. The setup was simple. A mother and a young child were brought into a room together. Then the mother left. Then she returned. What Ainsworth was watching was how the child responded to both moments, separation and reunion. Most children showed what you would expect. Distress when the mother left, relief when she came back, the attachment system working exactly as it was designed to. But one group of children responded differently. When the mother left, they did not cry. They continued playing. They appeared, for all purposes, unbothered. When she returned, they did not reach for her. From the outside, this looked like indifference, like a child who simply did not need the closeness that much. Then, the physiological data came back. Their heart rates were elevated the entire time. They were not indifferent. They were containing, running a constant internal effort to suppress the distress that their external behavior gave no sign of. They had learned, through repeated experience with a caregiver who was not consistently responsive, that showing need did not produce comfort, that reaching out created more pain than it resolved. So they stopped reaching. They did not stop feeling. The person who goes quiet right after things get good is running the same system. Older, more practiced, often invisible even to themselves. The distance is not the absence of feeling. It is frequently its most acute expression. The second explanation is the one most people land on. They're afraid of commitment. It has the shape of an answer. But there is a distinction worth making because it changes the entire picture. Fear of commitment is future tense. It asks, what if this doesn't work? What if I'm trapped? What if I choose wrong? It is about the horizon. What is promised? What is permanent? What comes after? What is happening here is present tense. The intimacy already arrived, not a promise of closeness, actual closeness, a real conversation at 2 a.m., someone saying "I see you" and meaning it, being known, being needed, being, without warning, someone another person has started to rely on. That is the trigger, not the future, the present. Researchers studying this have drawn a careful distinction between fear of commitment and what they call fear of intimacy. The discomfort of emotional closeness itself, independent of where it might lead. The relationship does not have to be serious to trigger it. It just has to be real. And for some people, real is the most threatening thing a relationship can become. The third explanation is the harshest, and in some ways, the most understandable. They are selfish, emotionally immature. They take what they need and retreat when anything is required in return. There is enough truth in this to make it stick. But there is a specific psychological mechanism that complicates it, one documented by researchers Stephen Berglass and Edward Jones in 1978 in their work on a pattern they called self-handicapping. The finding? Simplified. When the emotional stakes of an outcome rise, some people create conditions that make failure easier to absorb. They introduce obstacles. They reduce their investment before the result arrives, not because they do not care, but because they care enough that losing has become too costly to face directly. Applied here, when something good becomes real, the emotional investment increases. The person now has something to lose, not just the relationship, but the version of themselves that is wanted, seen, valued by this specific person. The exit is not casual, it is preemptive. They are removing themselves before what they now care about can be taken from them. Underneath this, often, is something quieter, a belief, not always conscious, rarely examined, that good things do not stay, that they are not the kind of person good things stay for. When you carry that belief, receiving love is not comfort. It is the start of a countdown. Leaving first is not selfishness in the simple sense. It is a form of control, the only form that feels available. So here is what is actually happening. Somewhere, early and repeatedly, closeness produced pain. Not always dramatically, sometimes just the slow accumulation of reaching and not being met, of needing and learning that need was a liability, of showing something real about yourself and finding the room did not hold it safely. The nervous system is a learner. It takes what happened and builds a rule from it. The rule, in its most distilled form, closeness means eventual loss. The only way to manage that loss is to be the one who initiates it. In a 1987 study, researchers Cindy Hazan and Philip Shaver found that roughly 1 in 4 adults in their sample carried this pattern, what attachment researchers classify as an avoidant attachment orientation, into their adult relationships, a system built on exactly this logic. Pull back before the pull becomes a need. Manage distance before distance is imposed on you. The number is worth sitting with. This is not a rare edge case. It is a very common human adaptation to a very common human experience. And here is the part that almost never makes it into the conversation. The strategy worked. At some point, in some context, learning not to need people, learning to look unbothered when you were not, learning to leave before being left, reduced the pain. It was a rational response to a situation that offered few other options. The problem is that the nervous system does not automatically revise its rules when the situation changes. The protection that made sense then applies now to people who have done nothing to deserve it, to relationships that might have held if the departure had not arrived first. This is not a diagnosis. It describes a pattern, not a personality. Research on attachment suggests these orientations are not fixed. They can shift with consistent relationships and genuine self-awareness. But first, they have to be recognized. Here is how the loop runs. Something good arrives. Closeness, warmth, the genuine thing. The nervous system reads it as a warning. The person withdraws, sometimes consciously, more often through a set of small behaviors that feel like preference rather than pattern. Shorter answers, canceled plans, a general cooling that they themselves might not fully register as a choice. The good thing begins to recede. Sometimes the other person leaves. Sometimes they stay and go cold in return. Sometimes they pursue, which briefly resolves the anxiety because the distance has been restored to a level the nervous system recognizes as safe. In every version, the prediction is confirmed. Closeness led to distance. Things got good and then they didn't. What the loop never accounts for is its own authorship. The withdrawal created the outcome it was protecting against. The belief maintained itself by manufacturing the evidence. And so it continues. Not because the person is broken, because the system is doing exactly what it was built to do. The cost accumulates quietly. A pattern of almost relationships, connections that got close and then dissolved. A private, recurring confusion about why the things that seem most within reach are the hardest to hold. There are 2 things that need to be said at the same time, and both of them are true. Understanding why someone disappears does not make the disappearing okay. The people on the other side of this, the ones who stayed, who got close, who watched the warmth become distance without being able to locate the reason, they lost something real. That loss does not become smaller because there is now an explanation for it. The damage is the damage. Understanding the mechanism does not undo what the mechanism did, and yet, the question changes. What is wrong with them was never the right question. Not because it was unkind, but because it was too small. It located the problem in someone's character and left it there. It turned a pattern into a verdict. The more accurate question, and the harder one, what would it take to stay? Not as a self-improvement directive, as a genuine, unresolved question, the kind that opens something rather than closes it. For the person who recognized something in the last few minutes, what would it mean to let something good become real without immediately building the exit? For the person who has watched someone go, What does it look like to understand something fully and still hold it accountable? We do not all disappear in the same ways, but most of us have, at some point, moved away from something good before we were certain we wanted to leave. The difference is only in how automatic it has become, and whether we have started to notice.